Hello and welcome back to my channel. This is Avery's Adventures in Cooking. Last week we made Spam fried rice. This week we're making a Filipino classic, Pancit Bihon. I always eat this when I'm at Easter, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's with my family, and now you can too. First of all, what is pancit? Well, pancit, spelled P-A-N-C-I-T or P-A-N-S-I-T, actually comes from the Hokkien or Southeastern Chinese root words pian isit, meaning something that is conveniently cooked. And nothing truer could be said about this recipe. I think it took me 30 minutes max. And we're going to be seeing how those Chinese roots really come into play today with the ingredients that we're going to be using, as well as a lot of the tools we're using today. Alrighty, so for our ingredients today, we are going to have celery, cabbage, carrots, onion, garlic, chicken breast, chicken stock, which isn't in the picture, as well as sesame oil, soy sauce, and some pepper. This specific brand of noodles called Excellent is really important to find. It's a rice-based vermicelli noodle called Bihon, and as you can see later, there are a ton of different kinds of noodles to choose from, but they don't quite hold up as well when you stir fry them. They lose their shape a little bit, so be on the lookout for this kind of noodle if you want to remake this dish. So to start off, we're just going to be cutting our veggies into long, thin strips. If you are French trained in the kitchen, it's called a julienne cut. We want these to be mostly uniform in terms of thinness and length, just so that they cook mostly evenly and you can feel that uniformity in your mouth when you're eating it later. And then for the garlic, we're just going to be mincing that up. It's 4 whole cloves of garlic and equal parts cabbage, carrot, and celery for the most part, and half an onion. And then similarly to the vegetables, we're going to be cutting our chicken into long, thin strips as well. As you can see here, I have a little bit too many noodles, so I'm just separating that package so I have just the right amount. Alrighty, to start, we're going to have a wok on medium heat, and we're going to be warming up our oil. I'm choosing sesame oil today, although you can make this with olive oil. That's just the Spanish way of doing it instead of the Chinese way, and either are acceptable because this dish comes from a time period when both of those cultures intermingled in the Philippines. Alright, now that our oil is nice and toasted and coating our wok, we're going to add those onions. And we want them to be pretty evenly coated in that oil, and we want them to be a little bit more translucent before we put our next ingredient in. So right now I'm just stirring, making sure those are all nice and even. And as you can see here, they're a little bit more wilted and they've become a little bit more translucent, which means that they are just about ready for the next ingredient, which is garlic. We're going to be adding our minced garlic. We're starting with our aromatic base to really set the tone for the rest of the meal. So garlic, onions, it's going to give us a really good, deep, rich flavor for the base of our dish. And now that our aromatics are in, we can add our chicken and give that a nice good stir. So at this point in cooking, we're going to see a lot of variations and different kinds of pancit based on the region of the Philippines that you're making it in. So regional differences mostly include variances in protein. Pancit Bihon, for example, can be made with chicken, like the one I'm making now, but you can also add shrimp or even Chinese sausages. Other regional differences depend on the location and the natural resources available. So Pancit Malabon, for example, is from a fishing port up north, and so it's going to have seafood like oysters and squid and mussels. But inland towns will have natural resources from the land, like Pancit Luglog, which will have shrimp and pork and tofu and eggs. And so we can see a lot of these variances are dependent on what's available. And now we're going to be adding our carrots. We're adding them separately and I'll explain why in a minute, but for now, let's listen to the sizzle. Okay, so the reason we're adding all of our veggies separately is because we don't want them to overcook. The crunchy factor, the crunchiness by the end of the dish is a really important part of pancit. You'll notice if you make this at home, the noodles are the only soft part of the dish. And each of these vegetables cook slightly differently, which is why we can't just be adding them in all at the same time expecting them to. And because we're using a Chinese tool like the wok, we should treat it like a wok. You know, it's stir fry. I can't lay it on fire, but I sure can give it a nice flip, and you should too. Alright, so I'm gonna go ahead and tell you what I'm doing in the video ahead of time so that I can get a jump start on talking about the history of the dish and all the cultural relationships that were going on at the time that it was being developed in the Philippines. So right now I'm adding the cabbage and then giving that a good stir. And next I'll be adding the chicken stock and the soy sauce and seasoning it with a little bit of black pepper before moving on to the next step. So we're going to start our history in the 10th century, which is when many early historical documents record the first Chinese immigrants coming to the Philippines. A lot of this movement was because of trade and trade benefits. The Chinese saw the galleon trade coming in and the Mexican silver coming in from Spanish influence, and so the Chinese brought a lot of their wares to trade, things like silks, ivory combs, gold, and jade, things that were of high value on the European market and thus high value to the Spaniards, to the Spanish colonials that were living in the Philippines. Now, there were other things that the Chinese brought with them that the Spanish saw value in, things like their skills, their physical labor, their ability to work. This craftsmanship also allowed them to have opportunities to build the walls in Manila. It gave them jobs in the fortress that was Intramuros, the walled city of Manila. There was such an influx by the 16th century, mostly due to poverty and social upheaval in mainland China, and therefore there was a lot of movement in the Fujianese and Cantonese Chinese populations coming to the Philippines, that the Spanish decided that they should have their own separate area to live in outside of Manila, because the Spanish started to feel threatened and feel really vulnerable by this large immigrant population. To maintain control, there was this external Chinese population, external being outside of Manila. There was a large overcrowding issue happening. The Spanish wanted more assimilation to occur, and so there was a movement for religious conversion, converting the Chinese immigrants to Catholicism, to Christianity. The Spaniards wanted further assimilation, so the Chinese were heavily encouraged to marry into the native population of Filipinos, and they were allowed to the marriages between Chinese and Filipino citizens really allowed for that assimilation to happen. Unfortunately, there was still there were still incidents of violent conflicts with the Spanish authorities, and so eventually by the early 17th century, there was a massacre done by the Spaniards with the help of the native population. Tens of thousands of Chinese people were killed in the Philippines, and because of this, many of the Chinese tried to shield themselves from persecution and further oppression by converting to Christianity if they hadn't already, or even at baptism adopting or assuming the Spanish or Filipino name of their baptismal sponsor or godfather. While this was all happening, Chinese merchants and traders needed something to do that wasn't just building the walls of Manila. So they turned to what they knew, culinary tradition. As they immigrated to the Philippines, they brought with them their cuisine and their habits. They brought with them their ingredients, their cooking methods, things like the wok, like in my video, things like noodles, ducks and duck eggs, soy sauce, soybeans, sausages, and other affordable and accessible foods that could be eaten on a daily basis. A lot of Filipino people don't realize that things like pancit or lumpia have Chinese origins and Chinese ties with them going back to the 16th century. And it's really interesting to see how many Filipinos have Chinese blood in their veins, and how much Chinese culinary tradition is deeply rooted in what we would assume to be traditional Filipino cooking. So as we saw in that last clip, we're using the chicken broth to cook our pancit in. So those noodles, you're gonna know that they're done cooking once all of that broth or digo is in. Digo is the Ilocano Filipino dialect word for all of that yummy, flavorful broth base. So because the Chinese brought with them culinary tradition, they were looking for wealth and new opportunities that didn't necessarily involve trade or building walls for the Spanish. And so they decided to open up small businesses, and a lot of these were restaurants, and thus the panciteria was born. If you hear the word panciteria and think, well, I know pancit is a Filipino Chinese word meaning noodle, but panciteria sounds Spanish, you'd be right. Panciteria is an example of a phenomenon that happened in Chinese restaurants, where they would take originally Chinese foods but give them a Spanish name to really appeal to the Spanish elite, to those colonials. So things like camarón rebozado, or battered deep fried shrimp, and morisqueta tostada, or fried rice, have Chinese origins. But in order to really cater to that elite class, they were given Spanish names. They also sometimes substituted rich, expensive ingredients like olive oil in the place of sesame oil, like we mentioned earlier, or chorizo and ham instead of things like pork. And so we can see this pattern of Filipino or Chinese food that either the Spanish renamed or really savvy Chinese restaurateurs renamed, that is actually just native cuisine or close to native cuisine. In this clip, you can see me mixing all of our ingredients back together. We have our pancit, our noodles, our veggies, our meat. And just like that, we are all done with our Pancit Bihon. I'm excited to try this. I'm going to get ready to serve this up. So in traditional Filipino customs, it is perfectly acceptable to eat with your hands. Just because the noodles are really fine today, I'm going to be eating this with a fork, which is also acceptable. But just so you know, you can use both. And don't forget to clean up the mess you made with your tiny wok. All right, ready for a taste test? Let's see what the verdict is. Yay, it's good! Woohoo! Thank you so much for tuning in to Avery's Adventures in Cooking. This week we made Pancit Bihon. I hope you had fun. I know I did. Next week is lumpia. See you then. Bye.